All right, so for natural selection postulates, there are four main postulates that are part of natural selection. First is that there must be variation uh, in the population. Okay, and that variation ultimately comes through random mutation. Now, this is one key common misconception that students have, people in general have, about how evolution takes place. There is not a need that arises, some sort of limiting factor that comes up that then results in a mutation occurring to deal with that limiting factor or problem. Rather, there are mutations that exist and therefore variation, right? There's the different colored dots from our simulation. Then natural selection can act upon those differing dots. If they were all the same color, if there was no variation, then that postulate of natural selection would not be met, and we couldn't have natural selection and therefore evolution occur because there's only one type of dot. There's no variation. So there must be variants in the population that are better at dealing with a particular limiting factor. Now, as natural selection continues, you can have that mutation be compounded or become even stronger as selection takes place, but the initial difference has to be there to start with. And so that's our first postulate. So when you're thinking about this, if there is no variation due to mutation, there can be no natural selection. So when we're thinking about postulates, these are things that must be met in order for natural selection to occur. Our second postulate of natural selection is heritability. So individuals must be able to pass, so there has to be differences in the population, and those differences must be able to be passed on to the next generation. If that's not the case, we don't get natural selection. We get differences in who lives and who dies, but those differences don't get passed on to offspring. And so we don't get a shift in the population. The idea is that the next generation will be more like those variants that are best able to deal with the limiting factors. So we have to have differences, and those differences must be heritable, must be able to be passed on. Next, we must have a population that has the ability to reach their biotic potential. Essentially, they have to be able to reproduce exponentially. They have to get to a point where that carrying capacity comes into play, where that carrying capacity starts to matter. If they can't ever get to that point, there's just not going to be natural selection that occurs, because there's never going to be competition that makes it matter that there are differences. So there has to be an ability to reach your biotic potential, and there has to be limiting factors in the environment. So we have to have biotic potential. That's one postulate. And then another postulate is that there is limiting factors. So there is a predator or disease or ability to acquire food or shelter. Those things have to be in existence. And those limiting factors establish a carrying capacity, which then their biotic potential takes them to. And that's when we get the competition that we need. So there must be limiting factors for natural selection to occur, and there must be biotic potential. They must have approached that point. Finally, there must be some individuals that have a greater fitness than others. Fitness in this case does not mean physical prowess. It doesn't mean physical characteristics necessarily. What it means is an evolutionary fitness. How fit are you for the environment and the associated limiting factors that are coming into play there? The greater fitness is who survives and the number of offspring that they produce and the number of offspring that survive. That's kind of how we measure fitness. It's how much the reproductive success of you and your offspring are essentially how we measure fitness when it comes to evolution. So we have to have variation. That variation must be heritable. That variation must make a difference. There must be some form in that variation, in the differences between individuals in our population. There must be a variant that helps an individual have greater fitness. If none of the variants help with that, we don't get natural selection. So, for example, like you have attached earlobes and unattached earlobes. Having attached earlobes and unattached earlobes, there's no evolutionary advantage to that in humans. There's no greater reproductive success that comes from that. So in that case, we would have variation. That variation is heritable. We might even be approaching our carrying capacity due to limiting factors. But because there's no that particular characteristic doesn't make a difference in reproductive success, we're not going to have natural selection take place. So we have to have differences. Those differences must be heritable, and those heritable differences need to make a difference in the evolutionary fitness of individuals within the population. So that's the main thing from our natural selection postulates. Kind of an interesting way of looking at uh, how sexual reproduction could become evolutionarily advantageous, right? And primarily that's what we see in these flowers that could they could asexually reproduce versus sexually reproduce with another flower of a different plant, right? And what we see is the number of offspring that survive are much higher. That means that evolutionary fitness is increased by sexual reproduction among these flowers. And we actually see that repeated over and over again. That we'll get to in a future lesson. But just kind of a nice example of what is evolutionary fitness when we look at measuring it in this system, and how it's not that sexual reproduction itself could become an evolutionary trait that is advantageous, and then natural selection would favor that. And we see sexual reproduction in most species, so that's a good indicator as to why.